Magazine, the Toronto Star, and Rabble.ca. We have Blessings. Blessing is community facilitator at Family Service Toronto. She's a feminist, advocate, storyteller, public speaker, and community-based researcher in gender-based violence, sexual reproduction health, and human rights. She has 15 years of experience in counseling and crisis prevention and intervention work in girls and women's sexual reproductive health and rights, addressing issues such as teenage pregnancy, menstruation, rape, female genitalia, mutilation, among others, highlighting the blurred lines between culture, religion, and gender-based violence. She volunteers with the END FGM Canada Network, and Blessing is committed to leveraging research and storytelling to enable community mobilization and engagement to address broader social hierarchies, power identities, and existing structures that impact Black, Brown, Indigenous, and racialized immigrant girls and women. Last but not least, we have Deepa. Deepa Matu is the executive director of the Barbara Schleifer Commemorative Clinic. Previously, she was the clinic's director of legal services. Before joining the Schleifer Clinic, Deepa was the project coordinator, staff lawyer, and executive director at the South Asian Legal Clinic of Ontario. In her role as executive director, Deepa oversees the clinic's strategic direction and provides leadership to the legal, counseling, and interpretation departments. Deepa is directly involved in critical projects related to the criminalization of women, sexual violence, and the precarious status of women, the risk assessment of gender-based violence, and the interdisciplinary case management. Deepa also provides leadership for the clinic's intervention and advocacy work and has appeared before parliamentary committees and UN civil society meetings on a wide range of social justice and human rights issues. She has represented hundreds of clients at multiple tribunals and courts in numerous jurisdictions, including the Supreme Court of Canada. Deepa is an adjustment professor and visiting faculty at the University of Toronto Faculty of Law. She's also an adjustment professor at Osgoode Hall Law School, where she's the co-director of the Feminist Advocacy Program hosted at the Schleifer Clinic. Deepa was the Law Foundation of Ontario's 2017 Community Leadership in Justice Fellow, a factor in Twentash Faculty of Social Work at the University of Toronto, and she has trained thousands of service providers for the best practices and legal education to work with forced marriage survivors, racialized and non-status women, and immigrant law clients in the context of gender-based violence. And so with all of that being said, we're in a virtual room full of phenomenal women, and I would like to point out that it's such a privilege for all of us to be here to learn from each other and to empower each other, and I'm so, so grateful to be moderating this panel. I am going to lose my breath. You folks are so inspiring, and I'm going to just jump into the first question. So I'm so excited because we have multiple perspectives in the room. And the first question I'd like to pose to the panel is, in view of your respective sector, why efforts in addressing gender-based violence so far have failed in Canada? You folks have around 3 to 5 minutes per question, give or take. So I give the virtual floor to you folks.
So, okay, I'm gonna go first because I'm Deepa, do you want to go? I think we're all too humble, and I'm like, I want to hear what everyone else has to say. But as I was preparing for this panel, and as we've been having conversations in the past few months and weeks, specifically about just the state of gender-based violence response in Canada, I think coming from a leadership perspective and a leadership development perspective, I think with the growing kind of economic inequity among women, among gender diverse people, among communities of color, what it's really been telling us about the state of pre-pandemic Canada and then the responses that we need to have post-pandemic or as we're getting through the pandemic to addressing gender-based violence has been the fact that unfortunately, a lot of these incremental changes and incremental wins that the sector has been claiming have been very surface level and tokenistic and performative, to the extent which, it took one pandemic, it took like the first 3 months of the pandemic for all of those economic gains to start rolling back, and for us to start seeing literally how fragile the status of women, the status of gender diverse people and communities of color continues to be in the country. So I think for us, one of the biggest gaps has been to actually like systematically and intersectionally be able to challenge some of these rigid and oppressive structures that continue to provide the frameworks for how our work, whether it be gender-based violence response or any other form of advocacy, happened. So really, it's been something that racialized people, like women of color, have been talking about in terms of, okay, like you got one of us in the House of Commons right now, or you got two of us on your board. How's that going to pay my rent, right? How's that going to pay for my childcare? How's that going to be, allow me to receive therapy, or again, address all of those social determinants of like violence and gender-based violence that have been exacerbated throughout the pandemic, resulting in higher rates and different forms of gender-based violence, specifically against women, and again, in different ways against people with different identities. So I think for us, one of the things we've been really looking at is, I think, kind of interrogating, okay, what was happening, what has been happening in the past 30 years in the women's sector and the gender-based violence response sector, and how either of the wins that we've been claiming have really pushed us to a space where we can now like jump off and build upon, instead of those gains that were so quick to be like ripped apart as soon as the pandemic hit.
And building on what just Arzu said, first of all, Jasmine, you are brilliant. So thank you. I was almost embarrassed hearing that bio. It was too long, but, and thank you everyone at Newcomer Students Association, Sarah, and everyone for inviting me and gathering us together around this topic. And building on what Arzu just said, I want to just kind of take us back to 2015, when United Nations actually called upon all the countries in the world, while declaring gender-based violence and violence against women as a global health pandemic, that every country should have a robust national action plan. Following that, Canada actually took a lot of international leadership in making sure that some of the less fortunate countries in global South had that national action plan and legislations for that national action plan to go hand in hand. And here we are, 2021, starting to have those conversations in our communities and with survivors. So that's the perspective on why we are still having this conversation, right? And it's a simple answer is why we are having still these conversations, because there has been lack of political will. The ministries, the front line, everything which works with the mechanism to eliminate gender-based violence from our communities have been precarious. One government comes, sweeps them dry. One government comes, gives them money. We get funded for projects. We don't have core funding. So we actually are trying very hard to eliminate evil from our society, while also facing a lot of racism, xenophobia, culturalization of violence, calling it a newcomer problem, all of that. We have been working really hard while also being pretty precarious. So I work at a clinic which has been in existence for 35 years. And imagine an organization which has been working for 35 years but doesn't have tenure in its funding. Right? So those are the core reasons why we are still having this conversation. But coming to a little bit more at a granular level, what I want to share with you is one of at the very core have been failing, or why we have failed, is because our judicial system has failed. Our courts have failed. And what have they failed with? They have failed with engaging deeply with the equality argument that yields an impoverished and decontextualized analysis, which continuously allows a prejudicial treatment of survivors. And why is that happening? I think Arzu already just said it. There is a lack of understanding of intersectionality. So Kimberly Crenshaw did that work 30 years back, but we unfortunately haven't really till today actually understood it and actually adjusted our legal discourse around that. And that lack of legal rights, which has landed with lack of protections and policies and procedures. So I know we can actually enter this topic from various different angles, but remembering what happens in our justice system and how it impacts policymaking and lawmaking and how it impacts our capacity to advocate is an important point. And I thought that being the lawyer in the room, I would really like to put that on the table. So thank you.
I actually want to jump in here, Deepa, because you mentioned a really strong point that I wanted to touch on. And I think that our sector hasn't been able to advance as quickly as we would have liked, is exactly to what you said around the lack of core funding. A lot of nonprofit agencies are just chasing their tails just to be able to stay above ground, and keep their staff and keep their doors open and serve their clients. And it's this lack of focus to be able to address the actual issue because we're so worried about, again, keeping our doors open. And so I think that's huge. And like you said, Deepa, there's definitely a focus from our governments to on project type funding or project based funding, but that doesn't necessarily allow organizations to do the things which allow or enable projects to be successful. So we're missing out on a huge opportunity to actually address GBV from an intersectoral, from a collective community approach, because we don't have that core stability. And if you're not stable at your core, you're unlike it impacts every other realm in which you touch. The other thing that I wanted to touch on is that I think that for so long, we've been focused on one particular type of violence, and it's physical violence, right? Like when we hear about stories that hit the media, it's always this woman was murdered or she was raped or something really extreme. But to the practitioners in the room, all of you will know, and I'm speaking to the choir here, of course, that gender-based violence doesn't start with homicide and those more violent crimes. It starts with coercive control. It starts with financial abuse. It starts with isolation, and it starts with these key pieces. And there's been so much effort put into the reactive forms of GBV that are more blatant and obvious or more extreme, because those are socially unacceptable forms of GBV. Whereas on the other spectrum, instead of putting or funneling money into preventative action, and funneling money into education and training and community supports to prevent violence, what we're doing is we're waiting for something to happen to say, okay, yeah, now we have to intervene because it's too dangerous now. But at that point, somebody's already experienced violence, and it's costed our government what is it, like $100,000 or upwards of $1 million for every inquiry or every death that goes through the domestic violence court review committee. And how many deaths do we have a year? We have over 50. And so it's really costing us. And I don't like to bring up economics all that much, but for some people, the money works or the money talks. But truly, what I'm trying to say is that we're waiting far too long because we're so caught up in addressing the most extreme versions of violence that we're actually missing out on preventative control before extreme violence starts.
Okay, so you ladies have said almost everything. I will bring us back to, I think, based on my sector, one key thing that has affected impacts in GBV is the lack of race-based data. So recently, my friend and I, we carried out a research on financial abuse. The topic was the link between income and gender-based violence among immigrant women in Toronto. And we wanted to speak with African women. We reached out to OCASI, we reached out to different organizations, and it turned out that there was no race-based data. And what this does in gender-based violence is that gender-based violence is now treated in a homogeneous way. Efforts are homogeneous, interventions are homogeneous, forgetting that we're a diverse group. And so it really affects everything. That's like the basis, that's like the base of the pyramid. We don't have the data that, should I use appropriate, accurate, adequate? One of the eights. We don't have the data that is, yes, we don't have it directing the political will. We don't have it directing the justice sector. We don't have we just have women. So we have girls and women. We just have that blanket data. We don't have the focused data. And I will agree with Jessica when she says that we're mostly focusing on physical violence. When we carried out research, we realized that a lot of women have gone through financial abuse. They didn't even know it till we started talking about it. But to them, before we started, they never saw it as abuse. Their mindset towards abuse was, he hits me, he yells at me. But the moment we started talking, these women realized, oh my God, I am being abused financially. So I would say that for me, the work that I do in the community as a facilitator and also as a researcher, I always meet issues with data. So I have to work extra hard to now generate race-based data that I want to work with because the system doesn't have it. And I think that without data, it's going to affect what Deepa said. It's going to affect what everybody has said. That's the base. I will pass it on to the next person.
Yeah, and I guess for me, I mean, I appreciate everything that's been shared so far and everything that all the speakers are touching on really resonates with me. And from where I sit, I think, you know, similar to what Deepa and others have shared, is that I don't think the issue of gender-based violence has been properly prioritized and understood by policymakers and elected officials. And there are definitely systemic shortcomings when it comes to addressing and prioritizing issues that primarily or disproportionately affect women. Of course, also other gender diverse communities, but primarily women. And I mean, governments for the longest time have taken a gender neutral, race neutral, one size fits all approach to formulating policy, public policy, and in terms of just the approach to policy options. So it's not surprising that we're in this situation that we're in. It's by design, really. We're talking about decades of underinvestment and a lack of listening to women's advocacy bodies and just communities of feminists and survivors raising attention to these issues and the complexity and the nuances of the issues, right? And it does feel like every generation has a similar conversation around a similar set of issues that have never quite been resolved because of a lack of, again, comprehensive analysis, prioritization of the issue, the political will piece, and then the adequate investment in the solutions. And the thing with gender-based violence is that it intersects with a whole host of other issues that governments haven't responded adequately to. We're talking about income inequality, we're talking about poverty, we're talking about, you know, systemic labor market discrimination, institutional racism, the inadequacy of housing and housing options. So these issues really intersect and compound harmful experiences for women and other survivors of gender-based violence. And what we really need is an intraministerial, intragovernmental, horizontal approach, centering, you know, the voices of the communities who are directly impacted in the conversations around solutions, because it's such a complex issue, and yet the
solutions are we need investment in robust social programs.
I'm hearing different perspectives, but also very common threads and themes of intersectionality, one size fits all, lack of political will. So definitely we see the problem, we just need to be heard. And I wish I could give you folks all the money and all the power to just fix it. That goes to my next question now. So considering your respective sector, what specific gender-based violence case management changes and or efforts is needed to better support survivors? I don't know who would like to start, but I'm giving you folks the virtual floor again because you guys did a great job.
So let me start. I will say that the specific gender-based violence case management changes that from work, and what I think will work is a collaborative approach. So I see that a lot of sectors are working in silos. So the legal structure is here, the medical sector is there, you know, everyone is working in silos. And one thing that the easiest way to lose a survivor is bureaucracy. So if a survivor feels that I have to reach out to this person to access the legal sector, I have to reach out to this person to access the medical sector, you lose them. You lose them at some point. They just, okay, they take what you can give them at the moment and they don't go. So a collaborative effort will, you know, will go a long way when the safety and security sector comes together, the medical, you know, these four sectors come together. So the safety, medical, legal, and psychosocial come together. So we have the survivor's consent to, you know, pass the data on. There's something that we don't put into consideration when working on gender-based violence. It's called secondary victimization. So I get to a shelter, I have to narrate my story. And then the police comes, I have to narrate my story all over again. I get to the hospital, I have to narrate my story all over again. It puts a toll on the survivor. Nobody wants to go through that. So, but if there is a collaborative approach, it reduces the effect of secondary victimization. And one key thing I'm particular about in seeing in collaborative approach is reducing the effects of police as first responders in GBV. When police are the first responders in gender-based violence, it puts people off. It, number one, I'm being very careful with my words. It discourages survivors. Many times it emboldens perpetrators, especially men, because most times the onus is on women to prove the abuse. So this collaboration must happen, but it has to be effective. It has to be mindful. It has to be survivor-centered and not system-centered. So I think what we have now is system-centered. We just send, oh, someone needs 911, her husband is abusing her, we send the police. But at that moment, that's not what she needs, you know? So a collaborative effort that is survivor-centered. And I will pass it on. 3 minutes.
I will take it from Blessing, and I want to say, and I don't want to be the one person on the panel who brings up funding with every question, but I guess that's what I'm going to do. But I will also give you what I think needs to happen. So first of all, you know, when you ask that question, and Jasmine, when you're saying case management, give us case management stream. Like, Simple as that. Most of the multi-service organization like Blessing is working at, or Jasmine is coming from, and Arzu is dealing with, we don't have case management money. We have workers to work with survivors on specific issues. We have counseling department, we have a legal department, we have a project money, and we have interpreters. We are not given case management workers. We are not given people who could act as ushers and conduits. So fortunately at the clinic for last 2 years, we have been pushing ourselves with the help of the fundraising and so on and so forth to actually have, first we started with one person and now we have another person added to that portfolio. And it's a game changer. It stops that revolving door that women are actually literally sent through. So go to one door, then go to another door, and then come back here. So because a case management person who's dedicated on that file, working with the woman side by side and supporting her while she has to make these life-altering trauma decisions, which are going to have a lifetime of impact on her life, with individuals in silos, as Blessing is saying. So that's first problem. This whole construct of case management does not exist in GBV sector. It might exist in health. It might exist in some of the social, like government funded social services, but it does not exist in the way GBV sector is organized. So give us that problem. So Jasmine, that money can be put to good use. And then I think following that, I think what is really important, similar to what Blessing was saying, that we have to think about, can we stop re-traumatization? Can we have wraparound services? So again, Schleifer is privileged. Our grandmothers, as I call them, designed a space which had counseling, legal, interpretation, all under the one roof, so that we can actually mitigate some of that, go there, go here. But we are not a shelter though. We still have to work with shelters to make sure that survivors. So that means then we have to go back to, can we actually share data? Can we really actually do that release that we need, and make sure there is an approach which is always client-centric, and she or they are the driving force of the decision-making. The challenge is the systems that we have to work with are the systems which are oppressing them, the systems that are actually causing all the kind of systemic violence against them. So their trust on those systems is really low. So Blessings was just talking about cops. I can tell you same about immigration officers. I can tell you same horrible stories about border security officers. So when you have a systemic issue of system not working in favor, then that intersectoral coordination approach, while it is a dollar figure challenge, it is also a systemic challenge. And I'm not saying that there is no solution in being collaborative. Absolutely. I think we used to talk about intersectoral approach to violence against women in 2000 or even before that. We have been talking about the same stuff that needs to happen for a very long time. But we also know that when you're working with racialized communities, migrant communities, non-status communities, it's really hard to actually encourage people to trust that system, because that system fails them on a routine basis. So me and Jessica were on a panel together where Jessica was moderating, and we kind of really dived deeper into this conversation. So I will pass it on to you, Jessica, because you were part of that conversation.
Thanks, Deepa. Funny enough, I was going to actually talk about that project. So Deepa was talking about a project that I'm on, which is looking at intersections or interventions, not intersections, interventions to high-risk IPV. So women who are really at risk of being murdered by their intimate partner. And so part of that project is bringing this international model into a Canadian context or perspective. So really good work. And as part of that work, I did some research on understanding how partners in our sector work together. And as part of that work, I actually found that there are informal mechanisms in which people participate in information sharing practices or collaborative practices, but they're extremely informal and they're inconsistent, and there's no standardization. And when that happens, that means we're not getting the same type of service delivery across the board. And what that means is you can go to one organization as a survivor and get really good treatment, and then go to another and just be like, oh God, what's going on here? And that's because there's no intervention, no standard of practice that's been developed. And so, like Deepa said, if our governments want the nonprofit sector to deliver a service and they want to fund us to deliver that service, they can't just fund the nice parts. They have to fund the administrative parts too, which includes the intercollaborative, intersectoral approach. The other thing that I wanted to touch on is the reason why a lot of organizations are so hesitant to share information, and the panel that Deepa was talking about that this organization had put together was really talking about the fact that organizations don't trust each other. And they don't trust each other because there are long-standing histories of negligence. There are long-standing negative histories between these organizations. There's definitely a power dynamic, I'll say, between, for example, child welfare, police services, criminal justice versus community-led and community-based organizations. Especially when we think about the fact that 78% of the nonprofit sector is made up of women, and a majority of those women are racialized women. And so when you have racialized women who are in a sector working with police officers, I mean, Arzu said it earlier, their experiences and their hesitations to engage with these institutions will also show up in their work. And it's not to say that that's a bad thing, but that's just the reality of people's experiences. And so really what we need as part to encourage this collaborative work is to build the trust between organizations, is to help people navigate legislation around privacy and information sharing in these pieces. And Blessings, you said at the beginning, and I'll leave it here because I ain't afraid to say it. I want to defund the police, divest from police, move that money from the criminal justice system into a community-based approach, because the way that we are approaching interventions to violence now, it's not working. Because if it was working, we wouldn't be here. We wouldn't be having this panel. We wouldn't be having this discussion. We wouldn't be talking about these things for over 30 years, 40 years, 50 years. The problem would have been solved. So to that end, defund the police. Thank you for coming to my TED Talk. No, I'm just kidding.
No, I agree with Jessica, and I'm glad that you brought up the fact that around 78% of the sector is made up of women, racialized women. And it's funny you bring that up because, I mean, let's be honest, most of us get into this work because if we've experienced some of these marginalizations, we continue to experience some of these forms of violence. And from knowledge, experience, and community engagement, we know what the solutions are and we know what the best support systems are. The problem is that it's like a cycle. Woman faces violence, woman enters precarious violence, gender-based violence, women's sector. She continues to be underfunded. She continues to be paid well below industry standards. She continues to be in spaces where she's continuously re-traumatized. She continues to be in places where she has to engage with systems of power and dominance that have created the structure for her to face that violence. And I feel like we need to, again, be really looking at like feminized labor and exploitation and all of these systems. And again, it really comes down to that money piece, whether it be funding, whether it be general investments in, again, just like those social determinants of health, including, again, like safety and lack of gender-based violence, and be able to, again, have those holistic responses, because I think the sector is exasperated. It's not that we don't have the solutions, it's just that we are barely getting by. We are barely staying afloat in our lives as service providers, as leaders, as whether it be you're, again, like just frontline worker or whether you're doing the advocacy work behind the scenes. So I think it's all connected. So unless, again, as everyone has been mentioning, having collaborative approaches, and also the strategic foresight in terms of really governments who are actually interested in addressing all of those different pieces that contribute to gender-based violence. It becomes really, you know, like I'm sad about it. I'm like, oh my God, I don't want to be in this sector. I don't want to turn 50 and be in this sector and be invited to another panel to speak about these things, right? And I think that's that reality for a lot of us starting off, is to, again, see people like Deepa, see other folks like Debbie from OCASI, who've been around for like 30, 40 years, and who I can sit in front of them and they can tell me about, like, 40 years ago at this meeting in that year, we had this conversation. And again, it really comes back to that whole idea of governments having that political will to actually tackle the problems. Because again, gender-based violence, you think about that, like most extreme physical form of violence, and you forget about all of those like underlying factors that continue to contribute to it. So again, I think I encourage everyone to look at the Ryerson Office for Sexual Violence Support, because I think they're a very good example of an organization or a sort of response that really works systematically and interdepartmentally to provide support to survivors. And I think, like, within the city of Toronto, if there was a way to find again, like incorporated and integrated support systems like that, whether it be locally, whether it be provincially, I think that would be really helpful. And I know like a university campus is a much smaller like kind of mechanism than maybe a regional or a provincial or even a citywide approach. But the fact that a survivor can walk in and say, these are my problems, and within a week have an incorporated response through financial services and through their department and professors and health services, and really not have to worry about going to each one of those touch points and have to re-explain themselves and ask for support. That may differ, again, as folks have mentioned, based on where you're going. I think, again, that's such a great approach that we know is working, at least in some spaces.
Those were phenomenal insights. I especially liked, as a recent graduate from post-secondary, the example of the Center for Sexual Violence at Ryerson. I went to York, same thing. It was very smooth sailing as a survivor myself. So it's possible. And I know we're living in a world where women will continue to fight until we eradicate gender-based violence. My third question is kind of similar, but Deepa, you did mention a lot about funding, but this is more about funding, Deepa, you'll like it. So what type of capacity in terms of training, funding, initiatives, etc., or tools, whether it be best practices, practice protocol, framework, policy, etc., is needed to manage gender-based violence cases more effectively and better support survivors, as well as prevent further cases? So this is talking about preventative measures. Who would like to start? The floor is yours.
Maybe I will take it on, because, you know, it seems like tonight I'm talking about funding dollars, and
somebody needs to do it.
Yeah, and I have to say that coordination of any kind at any level, if it needs to be effective, it needs people, it needs staffing, right? One of my mentors used to say that the way funding is given to the sector is almost like, let's put the money on the table and make it work. But that's not how resources work. Resources need people behind them. And that means that there needs to be a coordinated bodies. That means that coordinated bodies need to have a mandate to coordinate. And you know, the sector is brilliant. And Arzu, I want to encourage you to stay and fight with us, because I don't want to discourage any of you by saying, oh, this used to, but remember, there have been a lot of wins that we have been able to get. For folks in the room who were around when the conditional permanent residency was put on survivors of violence in sponsorship relationship, and we pushed back, we got rid of it. And that's just one example of how coordinated efforts can be great for case management, but coordinated efforts can be great for advocacy as well. We have Jasmine in the room who helps us keeping our eyes on when the budget is coming, right? So partnerships and coordination are a time-consuming process, and trust building is part of that process. So I would say that if we are staffed properly, if we have actually governments and policymakers who are committed to it, and they decide that no, this is preventable form of violence, it can be, no one more woman needs to actually lose her life in the name of gender-based violence. This needs to go away. There would be proper risk assessment happening. There would be proper screening happening. In terms of policy changes, my list is very long, but to just give you a snapshot of the human rights-based approach that needs to be taken to the gender-based violence, there needs to be a national human rights compliance mechanism. We all should be able to go somewhere when we see system failing and make government accountable. So there needs to be accountable mechanism attached to the coordinating efforts, because just saying we would have coordinating tables and coordinated networks, and then we'll create partnership, and then, as Jessica was saying, that people have really bad experiences with some of the, especially government systems, not necessarily so much within the NGO system. Who's making them accountable when they fail? And where are those bodies? We don't have that compliance structures. We don't have those mechanisms. What we have is something like Independent Directorate of Police Review, IPRD, which is like police officers running an independent police board for investigating police. No. That's not what we need. So if you will ask me, what do we need? I think we need a national human rights compliance mechanism. What else do we need? We need to have this national action plan that a lot of us are part of, having a clear-cut mechanism of accountability, monitoring, civil service organization like where I work and you work, to be actually involved and engaged on an ongoing basis, not just for the 4-week period or not just for the 6-week period, but on an ongoing basis. Again, I said my list is long, but within the context of migrant women, I think if we can just simply say that everyone should get status, half of our problems will be taken care of, because believe it or not, the status becomes a barrier for accessing services in a coordinated way, which is expected, right? You're expected to work with all these systems, and all these systems are which are causing you trouble and causing you violence. So definitely, I think I have a long list. I can jump in back, but at this point, I will pass it on to someone who's ready to take it from me.
Those insights were spot on. I knew you would like that question. Okay, I'm via Zoom. Would anybody else like to go?
Let me take it from Deepa there. It's funny, I wrote more funding, but Deepa handles the funding aspect well, so I will not say anything about the money. I think key for me is follow-up training. I feel like, especially the government sectors, there's a whole lot of talk about training for judges, training for police, but after the training, how are we evaluating the impact of said training? So I think last week, I just want to cite an example. Last week, RCMP, I think Manitoba or so, put out a tweet saying, don't text someone your pictures, something like that, because they will, it was subtle victim blaming, and I couldn't ignore. And I was like, I had to reply them to say, this is victim blaming. And to think that the police, at least I did read, the RCMP have been trained to tackle gender-based violence, to tackle cyberbullying, and then you're putting out that kind of tweet. So what happened to the training? The training did not go through then, because it means people just sat there, listened, wasted money used to organize trainings, but there's no impact. So how are we evaluating the trainings that especially government sectors are having? when it comes to gender-based violence? Are we just training them to say, okay, yeah, we've trained them, we've ticked this off the to-do list? Are we evaluating the outcome of the training? Are we seeing the impact? Are people coming to, in this case, are women or people who identify as women, are they accessing services more as a result of the training? One thing I think people tend to forget when it comes to gender-based violence is, beyond all the interventions that are available, one thing that travels fastest is word of mouth. And someone will tell someone, before you know, it spreads. In fact, the people who have never accessed the service are the ones likely to spread the news more. Oh, don't go to the police, they will treat you badly. They haven't gone, they heard it from someone, but they have also told someone. So the trainings, it's not enough to have those trainings. Are we measuring the impact of those trainings? One other thing that I am very concerned about is the government initiatives. So year in, year out, I hear new names of government initiatives. I hear the Family Violence Initiative. I hear the Gender-Based Violence Knowledge Center. And most times I just hear about them in reports. What are they doing? What is the impact of this government-based initiative? Because for me, I feel that it's mostly the not-for-profits who are doing all the work. No offense intended. I feel that, yeah, the minister might promise us a lot of money here and there, but the government initiatives, what are they doing? How are they working with the not-for-profit sector? Are they just letting us do all the work and then they come harvest our data and put it in their report and just, how are we working together? Those are the two key things for me. The impact of the training and, the government initiatives, all those initiatives they have.
It's interesting that you bring that up, Blessings, just because in the past month, like basically the whole sector, a lot of organizations have been running consultations on gender-based violence to inform a potential national action plan. Who knows when it'll actually come out and what sort of funding, anything it'll have attached to it. But it's like, where's the MMIWG action plan? Like, you promised that last year, 2 years ago, and what are we doing a whole other set of consultations for another action plan? If you look at the recommendations in the MMIWG, inquiry final report, that they have recommendations for housing, they have recommendations for integrated support, they have recommendations for government funding. It's all already there. Even 6 months before we were having this conversation, I was telling people, I was like, this is a full comprehensive feminist manifesto for addressing gender-based violence. And everyone, I mean, it comes from the disability community, but it's if you reach a Black disabled woman who is low income, you will have no problem reaching all of the other women who have far less experiences of marginalization and systemic discrimination. Because if you can't reach that person who is least supported, then you can create systems and mechanisms that will be comprehensive enough to then be able to support folks facing similar forms of marginalization. So it kind of felt, I feel awkward going now to the Indigenous women in our community and be like, hey, can you fill out this survey? As if 2 years ago, their whole community did not have to relieve their trauma with the hopes of a potential action plan that's nowhere to be found. So I completely agree. It's governments just throw money at a problem and expect, or a report at a problem and expect it to go away without having any accountability mechanisms at all, right? It's 2 months before the MMIWG action plan was supposed to be published, Carolyn Bennett was like, oh, now because of the pandemic, we've had to stop consultations. Meanwhile, the families were and the organizations were who have you been consulting? They'd never even begun the consultation process. So it's, I'm it's hard, and we're talking about police accountability and government response and accountability, and I don't want to be again, I want to be an optimist, and we're in this sector and we're trying to change things, but it's like these people were never accountable to us to begin with, right? So it kind of feels kind of very negative to have these conversations, knowing that, again, I feel like I'm the person who's like, oh, I don't want to be the Debbie Downer, but again, understanding how incorporated and like comprehensive and cross-sectoral conversations can be had for us to build power as a movement and as service providers. So, but you know, that by the time we start having conversations with the governments, they can't just brush us off as they've been doing with like Indigenous communities, with Black communities, and again, like, to be honest, the women's sector, you know, like election after election. So again, it's and again, talking about that whole intersectionality piece, right? It's like there was funding announced for Black organizations in Toronto. You know, it was a $2.5 million fund shared by 3 organizations, where we know like white women-led organizations who've got like 2 times that in the past 4 years from this government. So again, how is that decision making? How's that approach? How's that actual? And again, let's say we get an action plan. How's the behavior and the approach and the actual application of that action plan going to be responsive to the needs of some of the most marginalized communities that we face, that we, again, work with?
I want to take us down a different route here. In my own work with survivors, you often hear that they don't want to call police. They don't want to leave their house. They don't want to have to move their kids. They just want the abuse to stop. And then you'll also hear stories of how one abuser can touch up to 9 different families sometimes in their lifespan. And so that's 9 different family units, not even people, 9 different family units which have been affected or afflicted by violence. And so I'd actually like to see policy shift towards engaging perpetrators of violence much earlier and intervening on those cycles of learned violence much sooner. And that's where I think that we're lacking. We don't have the way that we engage women on feminist issues and on gender-based violence. We don't see the funding. We don't see the focus and prioritization. And I'm not blaming our sector at all, because we're already just trying to stay above board and stay above water here. But our government really needs to put forth, as strongly as they encourage femme organizations to be doing this work, they also need to be encouraging men to do this work, because it can't just be us, because we're experiencing the violence at the hands of masculine dominated groups. And so we need to see them doing the work as well to stop the violence. And I wanted to make a quick point. I was doing some work with a university actually, and reviewing their response to sexual violence. And I had said, phenomenal job, great work, love that, or not love, I shouldn't say, but it's a good sign that more people are reporting, because that means they're more comfortable. And they feel they're aware of the mechanisms and support systems. But when we looked at who was going through adjudicative processes, tell me why most of the people were racialized men, and their victims or their survivors or those who experienced violence were white women. And that's no coincidence. That's no surprise. It's been the same sort of historical pattern for centuries upon centuries, with Black and racialized and Indigenous men are put out to be seen as these over hypersexualized beings who want to objectify white women in some way. And, you know, society must uphold the virtue of white women. But what we don't see is that same protection for women of color, people who look like me, and I'm sure most of the people who are on this conversation and a part of this call right now. And so when we're talking about interventions, I want to see policies which, like I said, support men, in breaking these cycles of violence. They need to be intersectional. I know, Arzu, you started this conversation right at the top with the point around intersectionality, and yes, girl, like we need it in every aspect, and especially in this piece and in this component, because and I say our because, you know, I belong to the Black community, but our men are being put behind bars and are being sometimes wrongly accused, and they're often being charged at higher rates than white men for the same crimes. And some of these men, in the example of universities or higher education, some of these men are trying to better their life circumstances or flee other types of violence within the communities or other structural violence. And so they're accessing university structures to be able to do that. And so when we have adjudicative processes who come in and say, well, you're an abuser and you need to go. Do I agree? Absolutely. Violence is violence and everyone needs to be held accountable. But when we see who's being affected, it's disproportionately men of color who are being kicked out of university, whose lives are being upended, than it is white men. And I'm gonna leave it there. That's my policy proposal.
I absolutely want you to be at every roundtable at every university ever across the country. That, period. I'm going to go into the next question. The next question is similar, but I heard a lot of themes of intersectionality, cross-sectoral responses. And so my fourth question is, specifically considering your respective sector, how will a cross-sectoral response better support gender-based violence, case management efforts, and the work that you do? I know many of you touched on this already, but the virtual floor is yours again to answer this question. I can repeat it.
Do you want to maybe repeat or rephrase it? I think it sounds similar to some of the other questions, so I'm trying to see how differently I can frame my response. Yeah,
for sure. So how will a cross-sectoral response better support gender-based violence, case management efforts, and the work that you do? So I guess focusing more so on what key components, what bridges can we build with other sectors to better support victims?
Okay, so I'll go there. And first I'll say languaging. Languaging is the language we use around gender-based violence tends to alienate survivors. And different sectors have different languages for gender-based violence. I'd say that it's only the not-for-profit sector that actually use appropriate languaging. Other sectors have, languaging that tends to criminalize even victims. And so when the languaging is not appropriate, your target audience will not show up. If I know that already, the justice sector sees me, first of all, a lot of women don't like being called victims. Even though, yes, they're a victim of a certain event or incident, they don't like that word. And so many times calling victim just, alienates them. So languaging is very important. And that also boils down to collaborative efforts. Other sectors need to listen to the not-for-profit sector and use appropriate languaging. One aspect of languaging that I also see that falls through the cracks is we use one language to reach out to people. So I don't know, I have this image in my head, I've seen it somewhere, where English welcome is written in English, very big. And then there are other languages written. So there's obrigado, there's, and people can relate. If we have messages like that in different places, women will be able to relate to what violence means in their language. So for example, when my friend and I were carrying out the research on financial abuse, we were very intentional, even though, yes, we were talking about financial abuse, we did mention that this is financial abuse. We went the extra mile to look for words that could signify financial abuse in the languages of the people we were speaking with. So we spoke to a Tamil group, and we had the interpreter use, terminologies that they understand in their language that will make them really understand that it's abuse. So languaging is very important. It's very key to for that cross-sector collaboration. You can have the not-for-profit sector saying survivors, and then you get here, you hear victims, you get here, So languaging is very important for me. That's one thing I think that is missing across board. Even especially the media. The media also does a whole lot of harm with the way they report gender-based violence, with the way they report about victims, with the way they report about survivors. Most times it's almost as if they're talking from a point of how the victim, how the survivor aggravated the perpetrator, when the spotlight should actually be on the perpetrator, not the victim. Many times you see the faces of the survivors out there, you not see the face of the perpetrator. So languaging for me is very key. I will segue that to whoever wants to speak next.
Yeah, and to add to that, I think gender-based violence initiatives, they need to be tied to poverty reduction initiatives, public safety initiatives. It needs to be tied to labor market reform and immigration reform. There are a lot of women, undocumented women or women with precarious immigration status, who are vulnerable to violence because they don't have the right papers. They can't access child benefits or income security supports. They can't even call the police if they are experiencing abuse. And now they're in a pandemic trying to survive while, many sectors are being decimated by this pandemic-induced recession and waiting for a hearing. So it's a recipe for disaster, and it explains why we're seeing, frequency in both the cases and the severity of violence. The home continues to be the most unsafe place for a woman. And so, when you add layers of poverty and other forms of discrimination and oppression, I don't think it's a system flaw. I think it's a system design. But the consciousness is changing, and the policymakers are starting to look different, and people are understanding and leaning into their power. And so it does give me hope that things will change when we find the opportunities, the windows of opportunity. The pandemic is giving us, in a twisted way, an ability to say no to incrementalism and small reforms, and really demand transformation and systems change, because that's what we're going to need in order to grapple with the social issues that we're dealing with that are being heightened.
I can take from Jasmine, and I think I want to start with what Blessing was talking about around the language piece, right? So it's huge. It's an access to justice issue. It is access to service issue. It's a human rights violation issue. And interestingly enough, I think, as Jasmine was saying, the siloed approach is by design. And by design, we treat domestic violence, sexual violence, economic coercion, violence at workplace, like all are, as if they're all happening in some kind of a vacuum container for survivors. And and it's not actually a continuum, right? And within that continuum of experiences, which sometimes go beyond people's lifetime, is also the fact that when you are being othered by a system on an ongoing basis, and suddenly when you are a survivor, you expect that a coordinated response to it on a table is going to do the magic for her. That's not how she is receiving the services, right? When she has been experiencing barriers at every stage of her life, this one stage, which is the most traumatic experience of life, to expect her and they expect the systems to suddenly change their approach to her is not going to happen. So what are the benefits? They are huge. Collaborative approach can change the experience completely. It can get things done much faster. A survivor who is in a legal case and also needs housing at the same time, and also needs a child protection order, and also needs to move and change her name, all of that in a coordinated way can happen like this. I have seen it happen. I have been part of the case management when that can happen. But it does not happen just because government one day wakes up and decides that we will create now governed collaborative team with the structures of who will be the chair of this team, who will be the co-chair, and where there will be a structure of a table where there will be police sitting. So all of those kind of systems that are getting popped up, and then there's an expectation that all of that suddenly starts working as a governing framework. That to me, I mean, I always look at those tables and step back and I'm like, there is a problem here, because when you haven't done the work of building the trust, you can't expect this to suddenly work like this. I think we did talk about the challenges for Indigenous communities, and we are talking about the challenges for the Black communities. There is another community that we are not talking about as much, is the remote communities. And those communities are already under a lot of distress for not having access to internet. We are privileged lot. We are sitting across here talking to each other. They don't have those privileges, but these systems that are sometimes being created are being imposed on every community as once. So it's basically, we have now found the solution. The solution is everyone will sit across the table and they will all learn to play in the sandbox. And I'm like, thank you very much. I was not that person in my kindergarten. I don't think you can do that to me now. Too late. I will work with people in the sandbox whom I have worked and I trust. I will not suddenly trust a player who hasn't done their part, who haven't done the training Blessings was talking about, who hasn't done Indigenous solidarity as ours started with, who hasn't done work with the men in the community, and the men in the community from Black and Brown communities are being incarcerated. And by the way, women from these communities are being incarcerated. We have a criminalization of women project for the very reason, because coercive control that we started to talk about at the beginning of the conversation is unrecognized as those situations. Women are arrested, they are charged, sometimes not jailed, but many times jailed. 68% of women who are behind bars are survivors of sexual assault in their lifetime. So that data out in the public, if we are saying that coordination needs to happen with the government services, I would say absolutely, but not in a siloed way. Let's come to the table and talk about whole 9 yards. And if we are not going to talk about whole 9 yards, I think people are going to resist, because this has gone for far too long now suddenly to change with the magic wand. Although some days I do want to have the magic wand, by the way. I think we all do.
If I had the power, I would give all of you magic wands. To just, would everybody else like to add?
There was something that working with, in my daily job, I work with women, and then I also volunteer at a shelter, at a crisis line for women who are fleeing abuse. And one thing that a lot of survivors that I have been noticing with a lot of survivors, a lot of colleagues have also mentioned that, and I think it was Jessica who mentioned that first, they just want the, violence to stop. They don't want to leave their environment, because truly change is scary, change is costly, it's a whole lot of things. So they just want the violence to stop. But one thing that I also realize, and many colleagues have also been saying, is that many times survivors just, and this boils down to, that homogeneity of approaches. Many times we just want to say, oh, report to the police. Oh, many times the survivor, the intervention, okay, so let me cite an example. Working in the not-for-profit space in Nigeria, the last line of every proposal, we have a line we write miscellaneous. And miscellaneous covers for unforeseen expenses, unforeseen approaches, and many times the survivor across you, the survivor who you are dealing with, might not fit into any of the 5, the usually used 5 approaches for intervention. They might fall under the miscellaneous. So I've had survivors sit across me to tell me, I know I don't want to leave, but I am pregnant and I want to have an abortion. And so at that moment, she doesn't want to go to the police. She doesn't want to go to the shelter. She doesn't want to go, she doesn't want to go through any of those sectors. But she knows that the pregnancy she has is going to tie her down in that environment. So she needs me to maybe get her information on where to get safe abortion. She needs me maybe because he's also perpetrating technology abuse. She needs me to facilitate the communication to book the appointment for her. So I just tell her, go to so place and tell them, she needs me to facilitate that for her. But many times, the system tells us, this is how you have to do it. This is how you have to feel it. You have to feel this file. You have to feel that file. You have to feel. I have met survivors that the moment they realize that you have to fill a whole lot of paperwork, you have lost them. And then they go back and they face, the abuse all over again. So many times we have to be mindful of the miscellaneous. What are those things, the unconventional approaches that we can integrate into our work to help a woman who is experiencing violence? And I think it was someone wrote it in the chat that I'm trying to look for that. Yes, I hope I got your name right. She found herself doing unpaid case management work. And it's true, a lot of us end up doing unpaid case management work because many times what the survivor needs at that moment is not within the confines of our job description. It's not within the confines of what gender-based violence interventions should look like. But at the end of the day, the survivor wears the shoes. And as much as we mean well as first responders or whatever position that we occupy, we must always put into cognizance that there will be unconventional approaches.
I love that you brought that up, Blessings. I'm not sure how much time we have, but like a lot of those things that we call unconventional approaches are actually very unconventional within communities of color, like Indigenous communities, Black communities, who again don't have that trust with existing or these quote unquote services. And honestly, like what you said resonates with me so much, because like platform or my nonprofit, we don't have a service provision mandate. Like we're not a gender-based violence organization. We're not a first response organization. And like I've individually had to manage like 58 cases of like gender-based violence in politics, almost all physical, like within the past 3 years on my own without reporting, just because again, like I was talking to this senator and she's so well known in the like, again, in the sector, but she, you know, she was like, oh, like we don't want to receive your training because like we got training just a month ago. And I'm like, oh, who did that? It was like, it was this lawyer who came in. And I was like, okay, so you got legal compliance training. So you got a bunch of senators who are abusers told how to get away legally with like abuse and gender-based violence. And so again, when you bring up the fact that again, most of like the responses that we're providing are, you know, those unconventional responses, if we're not a service provision or first response organization, plus the fact that again, going back to that whole language conversation, we are not every organization, and again, it's been echoed through a bunch of responses, is working from the same framework. Right, you get like legal compliance frameworks that, you know, within police institutions and organizations, and then you get like those more survivor-centered and more community prevention mechanisms that exist in the nonprofit sector. So I find it so funny that it's like the reason we have to go these routes is because again, there's that lack of like strategic foresight and like political will coming from governments and decision makers who actually have the power and the funding to be able to at least start a conversation around having trust building and like cohesive and coordinated responses to gender-based violence. And the reason I start with that whole leadership and the fact that like so much of it has been like incremental and tokenistic and surface level has been that, again, if we're doing so well and we're well, you know, if like a 50-50 parliament was supposed to be the indicator of wins for like women in Canada, well, like that's completely failing and it's been a failure, right? So it's like we need to get past that, like again, the government like throwing us bones and the sector clapping, like knowing very well within our sector that we've seen these types of governments before.
Energy. Jessica, would you like to answer that question as well?
You know, I don't have anything else to add. I think that there were many brilliant points. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Awesome. So then with that, we'll have one more question before we jump into actual questions from the audience. But fifth and final question, again, considering your respective sector, what are the broader systemic and or institutional barriers that prevent your work done by practitioners aiming for impact in reducing gender-based violence?
I think just like exploitative labor practices, not just within the feminist or gender-based sector, but again, just across society, because most of the things that we're talking about and the folks that come to us are experiencing could be solved if they had some sort of financial ability or, you know, again, like higher status within society, like economically and socially, right? Jasmine said the home is often the most unsafe place. And again, just the number of students and friends my age that I know who've had to move back in to abusive households, who've had to move in with abusive partners because, again, in the middle of a pandemic, losing their jobs, getting the least amount of support, again, more than disabled communities, but again, like student and young women, getting the least amount of support from the government and the economy throughout this past 12 months, you can really see how it's creating this like generational kind of basis for potential like increased experiences of gender-based violence and other forms of marginalization. So I think going back to that, you know, poverty reduction strategy, like better labor practices, very intentional. And I think, again, being intersectional in developing an action plan or a gender-based response to economic recovery, I think is going to be huge because, again, these are issues that last people a lifetime, and we have like generations that are starting university, who are graduating from university into a very fragile economic status, and it's going to take them 5, 6, 10 years to get to a point where graduates maybe a generation ago could have got to, you know, prior to pandemic as a result of this economic backlash. So for us, really being able to, again, look at Black women, Indigenous women, and racialized women through like an intersectional and intergenerational understanding of how all of these different social determinants of health, including safety from gender-based violence, contribute to that ongoing marginalization. Again, through a coordinated government and cross-sectoral approach would be the number one thing that I would focus on.
I think,
Okay.
go ahead.
Go ahead.
Thanks, Blessings. I just want to echo some of the themes that were brought forward earlier on the panel, because I think that they're really the basis or the preface for a lot of this work really moving forward, which is reducing the police response to GBV, rooting out anti-Black and anti-Indigenous racism from our institutions and our systems and our processes and our practices and our attitudes and our unconscious or conscious beliefs, increasing the funding to feminist organizations to be able to do their work and survive, so that they don't have to worry or work, or organizations aren't working with precarious status. I don't like to use that term, but under precarious working conditions, I'll say. I think it was Deepa who said that, and I agree heavily here around the fact that we see issues of gender as sort of separate from the rest of policy work, but we actually need an intersectional gender lens in transportation, in housing, in finance, in poverty reduction, in all these elements and areas. So we'd like to see that. The last thing I want to touch on is the fact that our government doesn't and actively suppresses people from doing advocacy work. So the government will never fund an organization to do advocacy work. And usually when I think about advocacy work, even in my role, it doesn't always necessarily mean that you're coming at the government and you're saying, you suck, and you're waving the finger. Advocacy takes so many different forms, and yet our government doesn't want to fund that because it doesn't look good politically. And when I think about how we like to call ourselves a democratic society that is predicated on the idea that people can share their voices and opinions, why does that fall short in our social service sector? And whose voices do we hear the loudest because our governments don't want to fund advocacy work? And so I'd like to see more, youth-led, young, grassroots organizations be able to tap into funding to be able to really make community level change, which I'm not a big fan of trickle-down theory. I believe in trickle up, or you can't really trickle up, but I believe in, kind of moving up the pyramid or ladder, if you will. And so the investments, kind of large investments in small scale, actually ends up creating bigger impact at the top. And I'd like to see our government kind of focus on that. And I think that's what will actually start to move the dial, or start to move the prevalence of GBV in our sector, in our work, in our life, in our everyday.
Perfect. Jasmine, would you like to go next? I'm just gonna call on you folks so that we can wrap up because we're coming close to 7:30.
Oh, sure. Yeah. I mean, I really appreciate everything that everyone has shared. And, I like what Arzu has shared too, when she's, essentially like, how many more consultations and plans do we need before we see actual change? And if we're considering incremental reforms during a pandemic that has really, upended things, exacerbated things, brought things to the surface, I mean, what does that say about our systems and about the responsiveness of our systems, and to Deepa's point about the accountability of our systems, right? And is this idea of like voting every couple of years sufficient? Because it really seems like it's a very flawed model. And I think for me, it just seems like introducing changes in systems are difficult because systems are slow, they're archaic, They're complex. There are different, interests, different understandings, different literacies. And when you're trying to introduce transformations in established institutions, you're really at a disadvantage because of path dependency. And so we're thinking of the history of colonialism and the foundations of many of our political institutions. And it begs the question, is simply introducing a reform that another government can roll back sufficient in getting where we need to go? Or how can we push for those sweeping, transformative, radical changes that will really upend things for the better? And so I think that's what we're trying to do, or what I try to do in my position. It's hard because you are a charity. I work in a charitable sector. Our lens is that of a charity lens. We have to abide by the rules that the system has imposed upon us in order to engage with it. So it's like, it's a push, tug and pull, right? We want to see the sweeping, robust changes, but we know that change, while we can support in terms of the nonprofit sector, it's not going to come from within our sector. It's going to come from the streets. It's going to come from the new generation. It's going to come from, all the dynamics that exist in society. And hopefully it'll translate in some way in systems that have been really inadequate for a very long time.
I love that. Let's take to the streets, for now, the virtual ones, until this pandemic ends. Would anybody like to add to that, respond to that question before we jump into questions from the audience?
Okay.
Sorry, go ahead, Blessing. So go ahead.
I didn't really know what to say to that question, but something really came at the back of my head when I was trying to answer that. And for me, in the social sector, I realized that there's a lot of glass escalators for men. So even though we're talking about issues that concern, impact, and affect women, we see the men spreading all over our space. We see them rising through the ranks. And then we also know that there's glass ceilings for women. And then when it comes to Black and brown women, racialized women, it's practically like a glass building. So for me, I'm actually bringing this to us, like we in this space and then our friends, is to build the tables, hold the hands of more women to the tables, women who look like us, women who, who need to be at these tables. The more we are, it goes a long way. So that's, for me, that's because I realized that many times the system will always fight back. Every time you're working on issues like this, the system will always fight back. So there is need to have numbers, and not just anyhow numbers. We can pick anybody, but we need to have that quality numbers that will, stand head to toe with the system. So that's my response for this.
I think, what, to be honest with you, everyone kind of has spoken to the inadequacies of the social programs. I really like what Jasmine talked about, the whole economic mechanics behind violence. I also want to add that the failures of the policing and legal system is pretty exposed right now. So I'm agreeing with Jasmine. We have a window where we need to keep on going. Like right now is not the time to stop. Right now is the time to collaborate, coordinate, and get on those tables that Blessings is talking about. Something that I want us to kind of remember, that any initiatives or frameworks, wherever we are, we need to make sure that we are authentically asking for intersectional and culturally sensitive and respectful approaches. Because I have seen cultural stereotyping, false discourses of liberal West and backward East here in Canada repeat itself and bring up its head out on a very routine basis. So this binary application of culture, religion, and gender rights. So somehow somehow the culture and religion is the reason, and therefore gender rights are in some kind of a opposition to each other. That discourse shows up quite often. And I would actually invite all of you to think about that. If we are asking for rooted racial justice for the solution for BIPOC communities, we need to ask for rooted racial justice, which also is sensitive to people's cultural and religious and gender rights needs. They are not necessarily siloed concepts. And speaking to the COVID and it's the capacity to give us a new reality, I want to read this quote to all of you from Arundhati Roy, who is one of my favorite authors. And she says, "We can choose to walk through it, dragging the carcasses of our prejudice and hatred, our avarice, our data banks and dead ideas, our dead rivers and smoky skies behind us. Or we can walk through it lightly with little luggage, ready to imagine another world and ready to fight for it." So all you brilliant people, all you young people, be ready to fight for it.
Fueled and ready. Does anybody have any final thoughts before we jump into questions? I'm going to take silence as a yes. Okay, amazing. So we have one question already. I'm just going to read out. It's a little long, so just bear with me. Oh my goodness, where did it go? Okay, so their question is, in these types of conversations, is what about women who do want to report to the police? Sometimes I feel like there is privilege in calling the police, and at the same time, there's often privilege in having the option not to call the police. And they added to their question, many of the women that I support have experienced so much pressure to not report to the police. It becomes a form of silencing, especially in communities where the issues aren't being tackled in other ways, or the woman feels like she has no other choice due to the danger she is in.
I think the current problem for us is that there are no alternatives to calling the police in ways that substantively hold perpetrators to account in ways that the legal system should be. Right. So if someone wants to go the legal route, the justice system route, there's no way for them to get to that point, to access safety, to access support services, to access accountability without somehow getting the police or institutional organizations or like government institutions involved. And I think that's the problem we have right now, right? So when we're talking about defunding the police, and we're talking about divesting from police as a mechanism for violence, response to violence or response to kind of, again, like tragedy or other forms of violence, I think that's what everyone here is advocating for, right? It's like investing in coordinated, survivor-centric responses that do hold perpetrators to account. And sometimes, the police may be a part of that, coordinated response, but maybe they don't have to be the first response, right? Maybe they don't have to be the reporting mechanism. So I completely understand that, sometimes there's a hesitation that communities have based on experience. And then there is a hesitation of like, it's like you almost feel guilty, like engaging with a system is oppressive. And sometimes that guilt, again, it's like it's socially built, right? It's a learned behavior or a learned response, which is, justifiable and sometimes unjustifiable. But the problem right now is that there are no alternatives to calling the police. And that's the conversation we're having when we say, defund the police or move away from police as a reporting or support mechanism. It's because, again, there's no alternatives currently.
I just want to add, and I agree with everything Arzu is saying, I just want to add that as a racialized person myself who worked on frontline for many years, I have been part of the public education with the communities where I would go in and try to deconstruct what policing means and try to deconstruct what is their purpose and what does legal ramification or outcome of that situation could be, and how you might be putting yourself in the harm's way, and you might not want to call in these scenarios. But the bottom line, I think, Rifa, when you're saying that, I think it is Rifa who's asking this question. But I think the bottom line is that when she's in danger, who should she call is where Arzu is saying we are stumbled upon right now. Other than cops, we don't have any other space for her to call, which means that we would want her to call with all the tools in her toolbox. We would want her to be educated, know her rights, get the support, and then call. But then there are situations when that could not happen. And being the frontline person I have been, I can tell you that I have spoken from both sides of the mouth sometimes as a feminist working with the racialized communities and said, listen, if your life is in danger and there is no other option for you, call that number. Because if nothing else, there should be a disruption. But listen, that might not just be a disruption. That might be that she would get arrested. It might be that she would get harmed. It might on a plane to get deported from this country. All of those are realities. But at least if she knows that reality can happen and she makes an informed decision, it is an informed decision. She's not going to make that decision lightly. The problem is with the Eurocentric model, that Eurocentric model is very black and white. It just believes that that's the way to go about it. And that does not suit well for a lot of collective thinking communities. And as so many of us have said, the women most of the time say, I just want him to stop abusing me. I don't want to break my family. I just want this to end and not necessarily leave. But these are complex and layered conversations. So if there is more resources for prevention and more resources for education, I think there is an internal and external work that needs to happen. The external work is systemic change, but the internal work is that how do we do better education and how do we do better rights-based work from the sector.
Phenomenal. Are there any other questions from the audience? You can either put it in the chat or please feel free to just unmute yourself.
Jasmine, I noticed a question in the chat early on, I think by Lainey, who was wanting to know if CEDAW, the Convention for Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, because Canada is a signatory, are there ways that more better, robust connections can be made with that to be able to get any of the either prevention or any other work kind of going in this? The panelists, anybody would like to speak to that? I just thought I'd just bring it up.
I can very briefly speak to it. It was part of my notes as I think the first question, but I couldn't get to it. And I think, Lenny, you're on point when you're saying that Canada is an interesting nation. It is very strongly recognized for its human rights, its gender-based rights in the international corridors. As an immigrant, I was about to say first generation, I'm like, no, not first generation, wrong definition. As an immigrant, I can tell you, when I was outside Canada, looking at Canada as a law student, I used to be like, wow, this constitution, this charter, this framework, right? But then there was this whole other side of Canada that was completely unknown to me, which was the Indigenous rights, then the colonization, and the treatment of the BIPOC communities on this land. So CEDAW and its optional protocol and Canada's reluctance to engage with international instruments within the national context is very interesting to me, because in the international corridors, we are advocates for those very instruments. But when it comes to the national construct, our court system takes our court system and legal systems are basically the decision-making bodies, and they take precedent over any international mechanism. So as a legal clinic, where I come from, the Barbara Schleifer Commemorative Clinic, we have an ECOSOC accreditation just for the very purpose, because we find that in the local advocacy or national level advocacy, we cannot necessarily deploy international convention arguments or CEDA arguments in our court cases as frequently, because our own legal system takes precedent. And so therefore we engage with a lot of UN mechanism wherever we get opportunity. But saying that, for a small organization our size, which does not get any funding for that work, it literally happens on the side of our desks. But I completely agree with you. Not only CEDA, but the optional protocols given within and the mechanism given has a lot of protections to fall or to offer. And if our legal systems and our policymakers actually start implementing and stand true to all of those rights, we wouldn't be sitting here talking about non-status women and precarious status women and sexual violence that they experience without any resort. Going to cops, exactly to Reha's point, is not an option for them. And where is Canada's commitment to CEDA and optional protocols when it comes to that? So yeah, there is a huge gap, and there is also lack of resources and funding. Here goes my funding argument again, to actually do that kind of advocacy. How many of us actually have the time in the day to engage with international conventions? I think very little. And then there is also the critique of what does that really mean? So I won't go there. It's a little rabbit hole.
With that being said, we've hit the 7:30 mark. I know it's Monday. It's the first day of International Women's History Month, I believe. So a perfect way for us to start the conversation for the rest of the month, but hopefully for the rest of the year, until we eradicate gender-based violence. I'm feeling so inspired as a young woman myself. I'm a recent graduate, so now I'm feeling like I gotta hit the streets. I gotta get my picket signs out of the garage. And I'm so grateful that you folks joined us on this Monday evening. Take care of yourselves, practice self-care, community care, and let's make sure we live in a world where no woman is too poor to live. And live a long, healthy, happy life. With that being said, I'm gonna stop talking. Thank you so much once again for joining us. Also, thank you. Oh my God, I'm so rude. Thank you so much, folks. Seriously.
Thanks, Mwajgan. Thanks, Roxana. What's that? I cannot hear. I think there's something wrong with my speakers. Actually.
No, it's me.